I work the graveyard shift at a 24-hour gas station just off the highway. It's pretty much like a back road. It's usually quiet, with the occasional traveler stopping in for coffee or snacks. Most of the time, I spend my nights cleaning, stocking shelves, or scrolling through my phone. About 3 weeks ago, I started noticing a man who came in every night around 2:15 a.m. He was tall, maybe mid-40s, and always wore the same outfit: a black hoodie, jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He never said much, just grabbed a candy bar and a bottle of water, paid in cash, and left. At first, I didn't think much of it. We get regulars all the time. But then I realized something odd. He never missed a night. Rain or shine, he'd walk in at the exact same time, 2:15 on the dot. It became almost predictable, like clockwork. One night, out of curiosity, I tried to strike up a conversation. I asked if he was working late as I scanned his items. He didn't respond, just stared at me for a second, then handed me a $5 bill and left without his change. It was weird but not alarming, at least not until a few days later. That night, he came in like usual, but instead of his usual candy bar and water, he stood in the middle of the store, staring at the security camera mounted above the counter. He didn't buy anything, just stood there for what felt like an eternity before walking out without a word. After he left, I checked the camera footage. It gave me chills. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at me, straight through the lens. I told my manager about it the next day. She brushed it off, saying he was probably harmless, just a guy with a routine. But I knew something was off. The following night, I was on edge, glancing at the clock every few minutes as 2:15 approached. When the time came, I braced myself, but he didn't show up. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. Around 2:30, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the parking lot just beyond the reach of the streetlights. It was him. He wasn't coming inside. He was just standing there watching. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he was waiting for a ride. Maybe he'd changed his mind about coming in. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that. By the 5th night, I couldn't take it anymore. I locked the door and hid behind the counter, peeking through the window as he stood in the same spot, motionless. He didn't approach the door or try to come inside. He just stood there, staring. At the end of my shift, I asked one of the morning workers to walk me to my car. She laughed it off, said I was being paranoid, but she came with me anyway. When I got home, I pulled the blinds shut and double-locked the door. That's when I found the note. It was tucked inside my jacket pocket, the same jacket I'd left hanging in the break room at work. My stomach dropped as I unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, and it only had 3 words: "Don't lock up." I didn't go to work the next night. I called in sick and spent the evening glued to my couch, every light in the house on. Around 2:15, I peeked out the window. The street was empty. No cars or suspicious people that I could see. I felt a wave of relief. Maybe he'd moved on. But just as I was about to step away, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was short, just a single word: "Why?" I haven't been back to the gas station since. I quit the next morning, blocked the number, and changed my locks. A few times now, later at night, I swear I've seen a figure standing at the end of my street, just beyond the last streetlight. But there hasn't been anything else that's happened. Yet. I'm a 24-year-old female, and last week, I had an experience that's been haunting me ever since. I was driving home late at night from my family's cabin, which is a few hours outside of town. The usual route was closed, so I had to take some back roads as a detour. At first, everything seemed fine. The road was empty, and the only sounds were the hum of my car engine and the occasional chirp of crickets. But then, up ahead, I noticed flashing orange lights. As I got closer, I saw a section of the road was blocked off with traffic cones and a sign that said, "Road closed." That didn't make sense. It was well past midnight, and construction crews usually don't work that late. I slowed down, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I saw two men wearing reflective vests standing off to the side of the road. They weren't working on anything. Instead, they were hovering around something on the ground. At first glance, it looked like a pile of debris, or maybe a body. My stomach sank. One of the men noticed my car and quickly started walking toward me, waving his hands to get my attention. I rolled my window down a crack as he leaned in. He said, "Sorry, we've got a delay here. You'll need to wait a few minutes before we can let you through." His tone was overly casual, almost forced. While he was talking, I glanced past him at the other guy. He was crouched down, dragging something heavy across the ground toward the tree line. It was hard to tell what it was in the dim light, but it didn't look like equipment. The man at my window shifted, blocking my view. "Just a few minutes," he said. The unease grew stronger. I could feel his eyes watching me, gauging my reaction. I nodded, pretending to cooperate, but my hands tightened on the wheel. When I looked again, the second guy had disappeared into the woods, taking whatever he'd been dragging with him. Moments later, the man at my window suddenly waved me forward and said, "You're good to go now," then moved the barricade aside. I didn't hesitate. I drove past him, trying not to make it obvious that I was watching them in my rearview mirror. As I got back on the road, I saw them both sprint toward a truck parked on the shoulder. My heart dropped as their headlights flicked on, and they pulled out behind me. For the next hour, they followed me. No matter how many turns I made, they stayed on my tail. I tried to stay calm, but my mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Were they just trying to scare me? Or were they planning something worse? Finally, as I merged onto a more populated highway, they turned off onto another road. I didn't stop driving until I reached home. Once inside, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking every bolt. I told myself I was safe now. They had no way of knowing where I lived. Exhausted, I collapsed into bed and somehow managed to fall asleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling more like myself. Maybe I'd overreacted, but when I walked to the window to let some sunlight in, my heart stopped. Parked across the street was the same truck. My stomach churned as I backed away from the window. They knew where I lived. I was alone and defenseless. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and called the police. I tried to stay calm as I explained everything that had happened, from the construction site to being followed, to now seeing their truck. By the time officers arrived, the truck was gone. They took my statement and assured me they'd send someone out to investigate the area where I'd seen them, but they also reminded me that, without any solid evidence, there wasn't much they could do. It's been a few weeks now, and I haven't heard back from the police. The truck hasn't returned, but I feel like I'm being watched all the time. I've barely been able to sleep, and every little noise sets me on edge. Whatever those men were doing that night, I'm certain it wasn't something innocent. And the fact that I interrupted them and they know where I live has me terrified of what they might try to do. I was driving home late one night after visiting my parent for Thanksgiving. The main highway was under construction, so I decided to take a back road I hadn't used in years. It cut through miles of dense woods with no streetlights and only the occasional rundown house. I figured it would save me some time, but I wasn't exactly thrilled about driving through such a remote area alone. The road was darker than I remembered, and my headlights barely cut through the fog. I kept telling myself it was no big deal. After all, it was just a quiet country road, nothing to worry about. About 10 minutes in, I noticed a faint pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. Cars passed through here from time to time, but the longer I drove, the more I realized the car wasn't passing me. It stayed a few car lengths back, matching my speed exactly. I started to get a little uneasy. There was no reason for someone to tail me this closely on a road this empty. I tapped my brakes lightly, hoping they'd back off. They didn't. If anything, they got closer. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe they just didn't want to pass in the fog. Still, my grip tightened on the wheel. My car wasn't in the best shape, and the last thing I needed was a breakdown in the middle of nowhere. I decided to speed up. The road was straight, so I pushed the gas pedal, hoping to put some distance between us. For a moment, I thought it worked. The headlights faded a little, but then they surged forward, getting even closer than before. My heart started pounding. This wasn't normal. I couldn't think of a good reason why someone would be following me like this. I scanned the road ahead for any kind of turnoff or driveway where I could pull over and let them pass, but there was nothing, just trees and darkness. Then I saw it. Up ahead on the right was a small dirt path leading into the woods. I didn't know where it went, but I didn't care. I figured if I turned off, they'd keep going. Maybe they weren't following me after all. I slowed down and turned onto the path, my tires crunching over gravel. For a second, it felt like I'd outsmarted them. The headlights disappeared as I drove deeper into the trees. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, my stomach dropped. The headlights were back. They had followed me onto the dirt road. Panic set in. Whoever this was, they weren't just another driver. I hit the gas, my car bouncing over the uneven ground. The trees blurred past, and I could hear branches scraping against the sides of my car. But no matter how fast I went, the other car stayed right behind me. The path got narrower, and I knew I couldn't keep going forever. I needed a plan, but my mind was blank. My hands were slick with sweat, and every muscle in my body was screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then, up ahead, I saw a clearing. I didn't know what was there, but it was my only option. I floored it, my car skidding as I burst into the open space. It was an abandoned campsite. Old fire pits and rusted picnic tables were scattered around, but there was no sign of anyone else. I slammed on the brakes, my car sliding to a stop. The other car pulled in behind me, its headlights blinding. My heart was racing as I fumbled with my seatbelt, ready to get out and run. But before I could, the driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, with a heavy build, and he was holding something long and metal in his hand. I couldn't make out his face in the glare of his headlights, but I could see the way he moved, slow, deliberate, like he knew I had nowhere to go. I locked my doors and threw the car into reverse, but before I could move, another set of headlights appeared. They were coming from the woods, down the same path I'd just driven. A second car pulled into the clearing, blocking the way I had come. My stomach sank. This wasn't random. This was planned. The second car's door opened, and another man got out. He was smaller, wiry, but just as menacing. He started walking toward me from the front while the first guy approached from behind. I was trapped. My hands shook as I tried to think of a way out. The only other road was on the far side of the clearing, but there was no way I'd get there before they reached me. Then I remembered something. My dad had insisted I keep a tire iron under my seat, just in case. I grabbed it and clutched it tightly, my heart pounding as the two men got closer. The bigger guy reached my car first. He raised his metal pipe and swung it at my driver's side window. The glass shattered, and I screamed, throwing the car into drive and flooring it toward the other road. The smaller man dove out of the way as my car lurched forward, but I felt the tires catch on something, a rock or a log, and my car stalled. I looked up, expecting to see the men rushing toward me, but they weren't. They had stopped. Both of them were staring into the woods, their faces pale. I followed their gaze, and for a split second, I saw something moving in the trees. It was big, and it wasn't human. Before I could process what I was seeing, the two men bolted back to their cars. They didn't even glance at me as they sped off, leaving me alone in the clearing. I didn't stick around to find out what had scared them. My car started on the third try, and I didn't stop driving until I was back on the main road. I don't know who those men were or what they wanted, but sometimes, late at night, I think about the thing in the woods. Whatever it was, it saved my life.